Every night, Ed McMahon was Johnny Carson's shield, but one cruel corporate attack left the loyal sidekick broken and exposed. What the audience never knew was that Johnny's dramatic six-word defense was the only time he ever admitted his greatest professional secret. Johnny Carson was more than just a host. He was a phenomenon, the sole arbiter of comedy, power, and prestige on television. But even kings must answer to their kingdoms, and by 1982, the suits at the National Broadcasting Company Incorporated were no longer satisfied with prestige. They wanted pure, quantifiable profit. Johnny controlled everything that happened on that stage, from the angle of the curtains to the placement of his famous desk, but there was one thing he could not control. The new, young executives whispering in the hallways of the 15th floor, armed with spreadsheets and a chilling lack of sentimentality. At the center of Johnny's world and the true target of this corporate chill was Ed McMahon. Ed was more than a sidekick. He was the bedrock. Ed was the audience's proxy, the man who gave permission to laugh. Johnny himself once confessed that if he looked out and didn't see Ed laughing, he knew the joke had failed. When Johnny was nervous, he'd glance at Ed. When Johnny was soaring, Ed's booming, infectious, "Here's Johnny," grounded him. Their relationship was not a professional one. It was the quiet, enduring bond of brothers forged over 3 decades of early mornings, late nights, and the incredible stress of live television. They understood each other with just a glance, a history longer than most marriages. Ed was Johnny's only truly public vulnerability. The executives didn't see history, they saw a cost. They saw a man whose job, they argued in hushed meetings, could be performed by anyone with a good voice and a microphone. They suggested cutting Ed's segments, reducing his salary, or worse, replacing him with a cheaper, younger alternative. These discussions, cloaked in memos about efficiency and modernizing the format, never reached Johnny directly. The producers knew better than to tell the king they were questioning his queen. But Johnny felt the shift in the air. He noticed the new faces watching from the control booth, faces that never smiled. He saw the way Ed would straighten his posture after every commercial break, putting a little too much effort into his boisterous laugh, as if trying to prove his value to unseen judges. Ed McMahon was starting to feel the pressure of his 3-decade-long career being summarized into a single-line item on a budget report. For Johnny, this wasn't an attack on the show, it was an attack on his family. And when the stakes are that high, a loyal heart knows only one path. What Johnny didn't know yet was that the whispers were about to turn into words, and those words would be delivered not in a boardroom, but in a setting designed for maximum humiliation. The target was Ed, but the fuse had been lit under the entire foundation of The Tonight Show. The cold, calculating presence in the producer's booth was Richard Sterling, a 28-year-old master of business administration. His silence during taping was louder than Ed McMahon's most enthusiastic laugh. Sterling saw only inefficient spending, dismissing the show's magic. Ed was his primary target, an expensive anachronism, whose salary Sterling calculated did not justify the expense. Sterling quietly began a campaign of corporate erosion, slipping memos that questioned Ed's segments and suggesting alternatives, even moving his desk slightly for visual distraction. Ed, the seasoned showman, picked up on the chill instantly. He felt the cold draft of disapproval, studying notes on his desk to decipher the coded disrespect. This was a psychological attack designed to make him question 30 years of loyal service. Ed kept the wound private, determined not to involve Johnny, fearing the king of late night would unleash a storm. But the subtle slights continued, exclusion from meetings, his long-held parking spot relocated. Each minor indignity chipped away at the gentle giant. Johnny, being Johnny, observed silently. He saw the flicker of anxiety in Ed's eyes and the forced, slightly delayed quality of the famed laugh. Johnny knew his friend was carrying a heavy weight, handed to him by a callous corporate climber. As the scrutiny intensified, Richard Sterling was already planning the next, more aggressive move, a confrontation that would happen not on paper but face to face. The question wasn't if this young man would try to assert his power, but where and when he would choose to launch his most disrespectful attack. If you believe in the power of a lifetime friendship, hit that subscribe button. We bring you stories every week about the loyalty and human moments behind the legends who shaped Hollywood. The National Broadcasting Company Incorporated commissary was a bustling, brightly lit echo chamber of showbiz chatter, usually the safest place in Burbank, California, for two legends to enjoy a quiet lunch. But on a Tuesday afternoon in the late summer of 1982, this familiar space became the venue for an act of corporate cruelty. Ed McMahon, always the gregarious one, was nursing a bowl of soup at a corner table when Richard Sterling approached, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his cold, critical eyes. Sterling sat down uninvited, setting his briefcase down with a decisive thud that sounded unnervingly like a gavel. He opened the conversation with patronizing praise, complimenting Ed's longevity before quickly pivoting to his true, ugly agenda. He spoke of optimizing talent allocation and streamlining operational redundancies, corporate buzzwords designed to disguise a personal, vicious assault. Ed listened patiently, his 60-year-old wisdom allowing the meaningless jargon to wash over him until Sterling dropped the velvet glove and revealed the fist. "Look, Ed," Sterling stated, leaning in conspiratorially, "you're a wonderful figurehead, but the reality is your segment is expensive air. The show needs dynamic interaction, not just—" He paused, searching for the most wounding phrase. "Not just a designated laugher. We could put a digital screen there for a fraction of the cost, showing a stock image of a man smiling. Frankly, you're replaceable, Ed. A microphone stands with a laugh track. All that camaraderie? That's just good business practice. I suggest you start acting like an employee, not a founding father. And that's what we need to budget for going forward." The words landed on Ed with the unexpected, crushing force of a physical blow. 30 years of sweat, loyalty, and genuine friendship. 30 years of being the indispensable, genuine anchor to the king of late night, reduced to a piece of interchangeable office furniture. Ed's signature booming laugh caught in his throat, dissolving into a tight, strained silence. He tried to speak, to defend his history, but the sheer arrogance and coldness of the young man silenced him. Ed simply nodded, finishing his soup with a meticulous slowness that hid the trembling in his hands. He managed a polite, tight smile, the smile of a professional swallowing immense emotional pain, thanked Sterling for the feedback, and excused himself. He walked away from the commissary with the same outward geniality he always possessed, but the moment he rounded the corner into the deserted executive hallway, the professional veneer crumbled. Ed leaned against the cool tile wall, closing his eyes. The pain wasn't just in the insult, it was in the realization that someone so young and cynical could so casually dismiss the value of genuine relationship and loyalty. He straightened his tie and wiped a single, quickly managed tear. He was determined to keep the wound private, not wanting to share the poison. But as he stood there, gathering the strength to put his mask back on, he failed to notice a familiar figure approaching from the end of the hall. A figure who had seen not the insult itself, but its devastating impact. Unseen by Ed, Johnny Carson had witnessed the entire aftermath, and the look of utter defeat on his friend's face would change the course of the evening, and perhaps the course of the entire show. It was a moment that could have been missed entirely. Two legends crossing paths in a hallway, separated by only 4 seconds of time and a thin veneer of forced composure. But Johnny Carson, the man whose entire career was built on seeing things others missed, caught the subtle, shattering detail on his friend's face. He hadn't heard the cruel words in the commissary, but he saw the emotional destruction they had wrought on the man who never stopped smiling. Ed McMahon was standing in the shadows of the hallway, meticulously adjusting his tie, a gesture of a man trying to physically reset himself after a powerful shock. His customary ruddy color was gone, replaced by a pasty, unhealthy pallor, and his eyes, usually wide with geniality, were tight and distant. It was the look of a loyal soldier who had just received a grievous injury from his own side. In that instant, Johnny didn't need a word of explanation. He instantly understood that his friend, his anchor, had been publicly, or at least corporately, violated. Johnny stopped, not directly in Ed's path, but slightly off to the side, giving Ed the dignity of deciding whether to acknowledge the distress. The tension in the hallway was thick, heavy enough to weigh down the air. When Ed finally looked up, he saw the concern in Johnny's eyes and knew the game was up. There was no need for explanation. Johnny didn't ask what happened, he simply asked, was it Sterling? The power of their 30-year bond was in that question. It confirmed that Johnny saw past the corporate structure and straight to the source of the malice. Ed merely gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the confirmation Johnny needed. The king of late night felt a slow, protective fury begin to churn deep within him. He felt the same way he would have if someone had thrown a punch at his brother or insulted his wife. The insult to Ed was an insult to the entire institution they had built together. That night, the dressing room felt less like a preparation space and more like a strategy room. Johnny didn't demand details. Instead, he worked, silent and meticulous, choosing his cufflinks and adjusting his pocket square. But his focus was not on the opening monologue. His focus was on the friend across the room who was trying desperately to reinflate his persona. Johnny realized that the corporate assault on Ed was a mirror of the control NBC had tried to exert over him for years. If Sterling could reduce Ed to unnecessary weight, then the network could reduce Johnny to a commodity, a replaceable asset. His fight for Ed was a fight for his own autonomy. When it was time to take the stage, Johnny paused at the doorway. He looked at Ed and offered a slow, deliberate glance. It was a glance that carried the full weight of their history. "I see you, I know what happened, and I've got you." Ed returned the look with a flicker of genuine gratitude, a silent thank you for the unspoken acknowledgement that mattered more than any words of comfort. They stepped through the curtain and into the blinding lights of Studio One, ready to present their polished facade to 20 million viewers. But tonight, that facade felt impossibly fragile. Tonight, the laughter would be a performance, and the geniality a mask, because the insult was real, and the protection it demanded would soon explode onto the stage. The tension was now woven into the very fabric of the show, threatening to snap at the slightest provocation. The audience, primed for laughter, had no idea they were about to witness a silent battle of loyalty versus cruelty, played out between the desk and the wings. Have you ever had a friend step in for you when you couldn't defend yourself? Tell us about a time loyalty won out over cruelty in the comments below. We love hearing about true friendship. The red light blinked on, but the usual rush of adrenaline that powered the broadcast was choked by the heavy tension hanging between the two desks. The king of late night was on stage, impeccably tailored, ready for his command performance, yet tonight his usual effortless grace was missing. The atmosphere was supposed to be effervescent, but instead it felt charged, brittle, like a pane of thin glass waiting to shatter. Johnny launched into the monologue, the audience responding exactly as expected, punctuating his punchlines with dutiful applause. But the performance felt hollow, off-key to those who truly knew the show. Johnny's timing was subtly strained, a fractional beat slower than usual because his focus wasn't entirely on the jokes, it was on Ed McMahon. He kept glancing over, checking his friend, looking for the telltale signs of the pain Sterling had inflicted. Ed was maintaining his signature posture, his shoulders back, his chest puffed out, but the smile was fixed, a professional application of geniality that didn't quite reach his eyes. Johnny delivered a joke about inflation, a perfect setup for Ed's famous reaction. The joke landed and the audience roared. Ed was supposed to follow immediately, his booming, "You are right, Johnny," dissolving into that deep, infectious laughter. But tonight, the response was delayed by a fraction of a second. When the laugh finally came, it sounded canned, shallow, a desperate effort, not a genuine explosion of joy. It was the sound of a man performing his own emotion. The shift was almost imperceptible to the millions watching at home, but to Johnny it was a profound failure. That laugh, Ed's genuine, wholehearted roar, was the show's final, essential safety net. It was the sound that signaled everything was well in the world. And tonight, that net felt ripped. Johnny realized that the corporate critique, the suggestion that Ed was merely a designated laugher, had poisoned the well of his friend's honest emotion. The cruel words had penetrated the armor of the seasoned professional. He tried again moments later, improvising a small, inside joke just for Ed, something they had shared backstage. He threw the line across the desk, a small, hopeful offering of private affection. Ed got the joke, his eyes twinkling for a brief moment of recognition. But when the laugh came, it was still guarded, as if Ed was afraid to give too much, afraid to prove the cynical executive right. The cue card man, watching from the wings, flinched as Ed's forced laugh cracked, instantly validating Johnny's mounting concern that this tension was visible to the entire world. Johnny suddenly saw Ed not as the boisterous sidekick, but as the wounded friend he had seen in the hallway, vulnerable, exposed, and deeply concerned for his standing. The tension mounted with every manufactured laugh. Johnny knew he couldn't simply move past this. He understood that the only way to heal the insult was to confront the source of the injury, and he realized with chilling certainty that Richard Sterling was watching every strained moment from the producer's booth, feeling justified in his cruelty. The show moved into the guest segment, but the simmering anger beneath Johnny's cool exterior was about to boil over. He was no longer just preparing to interview a celebrity, he was preparing for war. The stage lights seemed to grow impossibly bright, creating a blinding spotlight just waiting for the executive who was about to make the biggest and perhaps last mistake of his career. The interview segment was underway, focusing on a popular but forgettable movie starlet, a calculated distraction designed to lull the crew and the audience into a sense of mundane stability. But Richard Sterling, the young executive, wasn't interested in stability. He was only interested in seizing control. He watched from the control booth, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitors, growing visibly impatient with the show's perceived lack of dynamic energy. Sterling's mistake, the catastrophic flaw in his corporate strategy, was believing that the starlet's presence gave him cover to act. He saw his chance to publicly prove his point about Ed McMahon's redundancy. Ignoring the frantic, whispered warnings of the floor director, Sterling pushed open the control booth door and stepped onto the brightly lit studio floor. He marched across the periphery of the set, a sleek, suited disruption in a realm of carefully choreographed entertainment, shattering the established rhythm of the show. He didn't speak to Johnny. His insult was a public performance aimed squarely at Ed. He stopped near the main camera and with an air of arrogant finality began issuing a series of loud, unsolicited demands to the lighting crew. Change the key light, dim the area to the host's right. That whole section of the set is unnecessary weight. We need to focus the energy where the money is, on the conversation. The phrase unnecessary weight hung in the air, a cruel, undeniable echo of the insult he had delivered to Ed in private days before. Sterling didn't even look at Ed. He simply gestured dismissively toward Ed's desk, treating the loyal anchor of the show like an unnecessary piece of furniture. The audience, initially confused by the intrusion, quickly registered the raw disrespect. This wasn't a technical adjustment. This was a calculated public humiliation delivered in front of millions. Ed McMahon's reaction was devastatingly quiet. He didn't erupt. He simply bowed his head, his huge frame folding slightly in on itself. He rested his heavy hand on his empty coffee mug, unable to look up, unable to meet the glare of the lights or the executive's scorn. The shame of being called unnecessary weight after 3 decades of service, on the very stage he helped build, was overwhelming. For Johnny Carson, that was the breaking point. It was one thing to fight a corporate battle in private memos, but to invade the stage, to humiliate his brother in the middle of a live broadcast, was an act of profound and unforgivable betrayal. The executive had not just crossed a line, he had marched onto the king's turf and thrown down a gauntlet of disrespect. The starlet paused mid-sentence, the stage manager choked on a frantic whisper, and the band leader, Doc Severinsen, slowly lowered his trumpet, sensing the imminent, seismic shift in the atmosphere. The corporate climber stood there, satisfied with his display of dominance, oblivious to the silent, cold fury radiating from the man at the desk. The entire studio held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. If you believe that true friendship is worth fighting for, share this story with someone who needs to see that loyalty always trumps cruelty. The playful sound of Doc Severinsen's trumpet, mid-flourish, suddenly snapped into a deafening silence. It wasn't the music cutting out that stunned the audience. It was the abrupt, terrifying realization that The Tonight Show, the most reliable, controlled, and comfortable program on television, had just frozen. Richard Sterling stood on the studio floor, a sleek, suited statue of corporate arrogance, still gesturing toward Ed McMahon's desk as if demanding its removal. But every single eye in Studio One, from the audience to the high-paid crew, was fixed on Johnny Carson. The king of late night, the master of the smooth transition and the effortless deflecting joke, had stopped speaking entirely. He looked at Sterling, and the entire studio felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. The famous, amused twinkle in Johnny's eyes completely vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute fury that was terrifying precisely because it was so utterly foreign to his public persona. Ed McMahon was the most heartbreaking figure in the room. He remained seated, his head bowed, the humiliation of being called unnecessary weight in front of millions of viewers sealing him into a private moment of deep despair. He was trying desperately to make himself small, to disappear under the bright, exposing lights. He had always been the show's cheerleader, the public embodiment of joy. And now his spirit was openly, ruthlessly crushed. Johnny pushed his chair back from his desk with a scraping sound that echoed through the silence. He didn't rush. His movements were slow, deliberate, charged with a powerful, dangerous authority. He was not just reacting to an executive, he was protecting his family. He walked around the famous desk, ignoring the frantic stage manager who was now mouthing silent, desperate apologies from the wings. Johnny walked right past the stunned celebrity guest and moved straight toward the executive. Sterling, still clinging to his business school bravado, tried to recover. "Johnny, this is just an efficiency issue. We need to correct the—" He didn't finish the sentence. Johnny stopped directly between Sterling and Ed's desk. He did not raise his voice. In fact, his tone was dangerously quiet. This was not a performance. This was real life invading the stage, and the audience could feel the authenticity of the rage. Johnny didn't look at Sterling, he looked at Ed. He saw the genuine hurt that the corporate slight had caused. The weight of 30 years of shared history, of shared grief and shared triumphs, settled in the room, demanding to be recognized. For that agonizing 60 seconds, time seemed to stop entirely. The cameras continued to roll out of habit, capturing a moment of pure, unscripted human conflict. The man who never lost his cool was about to show the world that his loyalty burned hotter than his fame. He was done being subtle. He was done waiting. The silence had served its purpose, allowing the tension to build to an unbearable peak. The king of late night was about to speak, and the words would be delivered not as a joke, but as a final, protective verdict that would end the executive's career and forever define the friendship between two legends. Johnny Carson's walk toward the confrontation was not a sprint of anger, but a slow, deliberate procession, the stage lights seeming to intensify the dramatic weight of every step. He was moving away from the safety of his desk and toward the fight, and in that moment he shed the last vestige of the carefree comedian. He was a pure protector. Richard Sterling, still recovering from the shock of the show abruptly stopping, attempted to regain control, waving his hands dismissively at the crew. "It's fine. It's just a technical correction. We need to focus on efficiency, Johnny, you understand? The numbers." He trailed off as Johnny reached him. The king of late night stopped, placing himself right next to Ed McMahon's desk, creating an unbreachable wall of loyalty. He was physically aligning himself with his friend. The celebrity guest sat frozen, aware that she was witnessing a seismic, unscripted moment of power. The air was so still that you could almost hear the frantic static from the control room as producers tried to figure out how to handle the unprecedented interruption. Johnny finally turned his gaze, not to the audience, but to Sterling. His eyes held no warmth, no humor, only the cold, unyielding resolve of a man who was about to defend something far more valuable than ratings. Sterling, for the first time, seemed to realize the danger he was in. He saw the crispness of Johnny's custom tailoring and the rock-solid stillness of his posture, a stark visual contrast to Sterling's nervous, fidgeting energy and cheap corporate suit. The visual metaphor reinforced the theme of loyalty, quality versus spreadsheet, cheapness. He saw that the man standing before him wasn't the genial host who tossed jokes to the band. He was the single most powerful figure in broadcasting, and he was profoundly displeased. "I am talking about the business, Johnny," Sterling stammered, trying to sound authoritative. "Ed McMahon is an outdated model, an unnecessary expense. We can streamline this operation. It's just smart business." Johnny didn't respond with a loud retort or a dramatic explosion. Instead, he reached out his hand and placed it gently, firmly on Ed McMahon's shoulder. It was a small, quiet gesture that spoke volumes. "You are not alone. You are valuable. You are mine to protect." Ed, who had been hunched over in silent shame, felt the warmth of Johnny's touch and slowly, painfully straightened up. He looked up at Johnny, and in his eyes there was not just gratitude, but a profound, tearful surrender to the protection of his brother. The moment transcended show business. It was a simple, absolute declaration of human bond, played out on the grandest stage in America. Johnny held Sterling's gaze, allowing the young executive to fully absorb the depth of the loyalty he had attempted to fracture. Every member of the crew, every camera operator, every member of the band stood in silent solidarity, knowing exactly whose side they were on. They knew Ed McMahon was the heart of the operation, the man who remembered birthdays and asked about children. The executive had only seen a number. After a long, charged silence that stretched the limit of live television, Johnny finally spoke, his voice low and carrying an absolute finality that echoed throughout the vast studio. The stage was set, the lines were drawn, and there was no going back. The next words out of his mouth would either save the show or end it. The 6 words that followed, delivered with the quiet, authoritative precision of a judge issuing a lifetime sentence, would silence the corporate clamor forever. The silence was a physical entity, squeezing the air out of the studio, broken only by the distant, frantic crackle of the stage manager's headset. All eyes were on Johnny Carson, who stood immovable, his hand resting like an unshakable promise on Ed McMahon's shoulder, staring down the arrogant young executive. The moment stretched, charged with the weight of 30 years of loyalty. Then Johnny spoke. His voice was not the light, comedic baritone of the monologue. It was low, rough with conviction, and carried an absolute final authority that reached every corner of the studio and every home watching across the nation. He looked straight into the eyes of Richard Sterling, delivered his verdict, and shook the foundations of the National Broadcasting Company, Incorporated. If Ed goes, I go with him. 6 simple words, 6 words that shook National Broadcasting Company, Incorporated. They weren't a negotiation, they were a fact, a declaration of total, unconditional solidarity. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for Richard Sterling. The young executive's jaw slackened. The smug certainty in his eyes evaporated, replaced by the horrified realization that he had not just insulted a sidekick, but had directly challenged the most powerful contract in television history. He had brought down the entire operation over a cost-cutting measure. Ed McMahon's reaction was the emotional epicenter of the moment. He had been holding himself together with sheer willpower, ashamed and humiliated, but those 6 words broke through his professional armor. Tears, thick and unstoppable, streamed down his face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, profound gratitude. His friend, the man he called boss, had just put his career, his millions, and the entire future of the show on the line for him. Not in a private meeting, but right here, on the air. Ed reached up and placed his massive hand over Johnny's, gripping it fiercely, unable to speak, his loyalty confirmed in a cathartic flood of emotion. The audience, witnessing this raw, unscripted display of brotherhood, erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a spontaneous, roaring standing ovation. People were cheering, crying, stamping their feet, recognizing that they were seeing something immensely important, a pure act of human fidelity that transcended the glitter of Hollywood. The entire camera crew, ignoring the technical chaos erupting in the booth, stood up and applauded Ed. Doc Severinsen didn't just wipe his eyes, he took off his hat and held it over his heart, a sign of respect usually reserved for a funeral, cementing the sacredness of the moment. Johnny looked back at Ed, offering a small, genuine smile, the first real, unforced emotion he had shown all night, and squeezed his friend's hand. He then turned to Sterling, his voice still low, and said, "The taping is over." The stage manager, recognizing a command that superseded all corporate hierarchy, yelled, "We're dark! Cut the lights! Everyone off the set!" The screens went black. The curtain dropped quickly, separating the audience from the spectacle, but the emotional charge remained. Sterling, pale and stammering, was quickly and forcibly escorted off the studio floor by security, his brief, destructive tenure at the National Broadcasting Company, Incorporated, concluded by 6 unforgettable words. But the night was not truly over. The emotional cost of those 6 words still had to be reckoned with, and the most important secret conversation of the entire evening was about to take place off-camera between 2 friends who had just proven that some bonds are more valuable than any contract. The sudden blackness after the curtain drop was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the hurried whispers of the crew dismantling the set and the sound of distant applause still echoing from the parking lot. In Johnny Carson's dressing room, the air was warm and quiet, feeling miles away from the chaos that had just exploded on the stage. There were no jokes, no drinks, just two friends, the king and his loyal anchor, in a moment of raw, essential reckoning. Ed McMahon was seated on the small sofa, still holding the residual heat of Johnny's hand on his shoulder, his eyes red but clear. Johnny, unusually subdued, poured 2 glasses of water. He didn't offer comfort or ask if Ed was okay. He knew those words were inadequate. He simply handed the glass to his friend, a silent acknowledgement of the emotional toll the confrontation had taken. "I didn't want you to do that, Johnny," Ed finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You risked everything, your contract, the show, all of it." Johnny took a sip of water and looked at the man who had been his companion for 30 years. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" he asked, his tone gentle, almost incredulous. "That man," he continued, referring to the executive, "didn't just call you unnecessary weight, Ed. He called our history worthless. He said that loyalty, friendship, and the genuine joy you bring to millions of people could be bought cheaper and replaced with a machine. He attacked the only thing I've ever cared about more than ratings, my foundation." "My foundation isn't the monologue, Ed," Johnny finished, his voice catching slightly. "It's you. I can't do this alone. Your laugh is my cue. Your presence is my truth detector. You protect me from the emptiness. Without your genuine laugh, Ed, I'm just a guy talking to a vacuum. You are my only insurance against the silence. That man tried to take my truth away." It was a profound confession, an admission of deep, necessary dependence that Johnny Carson, the famously private star, would never repeat publicly. Ed realized the 6 words, "If Ed goes, I go with him," weren't just a protective threat, they were a cry of personal need. He hadn't just been saved from professional humiliation, he had been affirmed as an indispensable piece of Johnny Carson's soul. The fallout was swift and absolute. The executive, Richard Sterling, was gone from the National Broadcasting Company, Incorporated headquarters within 2 days, his name forever associated with the disastrous moment he dared to challenge the king's loyalty. Johnny made sure that any memo pertaining to efficiency changes concerning Ed McMahon vanished from the system. The incident was never spoken of on the show again, but its impact resonated for the rest of their shared careers. For years afterward, people who watched closely noticed a slight change. Whenever Johnny delivered a punchline, he didn't just glance at Ed, he would pause, wait for that signature, genuine laugh, and then give a small, quick, almost imperceptible nod, a private acknowledgement that the foundation was safe, the truth was intact, and the brotherhood was absolute. The 6 words had become more than a network legend. They were the unwritten, unbreakable covenant between 2 legends. Johnny Carson was the most successful man on television, but the night he stopped the show to defend his friend proved that his true legacy wasn't the laughs he created, but the loyalty he preserved. He taught millions of Americans a lesson that night, that true success is measured not by the spotlight you command, but by the friends you refuse to let stand alone in the darkness. Ask yourself, if the microphone were turned off and the cameras stopped rolling, who would risk everything for your foundation? Johnny Carson taught us the answer. If this story of loyalty and brotherhood touched your heart, please hit the subscribe button below to ensure you never miss another untold moment behind Hollywood's biggest legends. And give this video a like if you believe friendship is the most important thing on the screen and off it.